Thank you, buddy. All right. So I do want to still do the same thing. Open it up. What's the first thing someone notices maybe in the very first verse there or anything? Worthy. Walking worthy of the gospel. So, worthy of the gospel of Christ. You know, when I first taught this to the high school kids, I actually didn't even have this as something to talk about. But as I've reread it, I thought, man, what a very high calling. Worthy of the gospel? Does anyone here feel like they live lives worthy of the gospel? I mean, to live worthy of something like the gospel, that's definitely, a lot more than we could take on ourselves. When you think, all right, if you tell someone, or if someone told you, hey, you need to live worthy of the gospel, just start brainstorming what would go through your head of like, okay, that means, I need to do this and that and this and that. We could probably think of a lot of things, but it's interesting what Paul brings up first in living worthy of the gospel. What's the first thing he talks about?
Stand firm in one faith.
Yep, standing firm in one faith. It's all unity, right? First thing he talks about.
With each other.
With each other, yes. It's all about unity. Living worthy of the gospel, what's it look like? It's being unified as brethren. It's being unified in one accord as brothers and sisters with one spirit, one mind, striving side by side. And that's living worthy of the gospel. Paul does the same thing in Galatians too. Buddy?
It's interesting and pretty awesome that he's talking about unity when Christ himself taught Paul that unity was in his conversion. Like,
yeah.
You're not doing what you're supposed to. This is the real deal here.
Right.
And like, who better to talk about this than Paul?
Oh yeah, exactly. You're right. Yep. Paul's the perfect man to be talking about this unity, isn't he? Because he's the one that's bringing the Gentiles in anyways. But it is, I don't know, it just really stuck out to me that the first thing he talks about in living worthy of the gospel was about us together, standing firm in unity, which, I think we do good at in this congregation. We can always improve. Living unified means we're going to be bearing each other's burdens. I know one thing that I could definitely improve on, I'm sure everyone could, is being more vulnerable with each other. We just kind of, hey, how's it going? It's going good. How's things been? They've been fine. How can you really strengthen each other and stand more firm if you don't even know what each other are struggling with? And I'm horrible at that. You can ask Macy. Vulnerability, probably D-. Not very good with that stuff. But to be vulnerable with one another, that's what we have to do to be able to even know, okay, yeah, you need strengthening in that. I've been through that before. Let's talk about it. Or even just praying for each other. And I think that's a huge part of being unified and standing firm is we got to know what each other are facing. We know the general warfare that we are all going through, but to actually talk to each other about that on a much deeper relationship than what's involved in just sitting in these pews, learning, even when we go to, events outside of this. We got to know each other on a deeper level to be able to have this kind of unity and live worthy of the gospel. So, anything else? Macy.
I thought it was interesting how where you get that picture of walking worthy, and when you think of the word worthy, I feel like sometimes you get in that legalistic mindset, or like if people think about the church, they think, oh, well, you think you're doing all the right things, all the good deeds, but Paul sums this whole thing up by saying that you should do nothing from selfish ambition, and what it means is to be in humility, count yourselves, or count others more significant than yourselves. And I think that is what the gospel is calling us to serve others, and there's nothing haughty about that mindset. When you originally hear the word worthy, you think, oh, that's a status, but that's not what he's saying.
Right, and that is why I feel, which we didn't really talk about themes, but we have before. That's why I feel this whole book is about humility, self-sacrificing, putting others before yourself. Because what we'll see, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but like Macy said, so we know walking worthy of the gospel involves unity, but Paul then says the key to unity, selflessness. And so we will get to that too. Robert, you had your hand up.
One of the first things that I thought about is worthy of the gospel of Christ. We all know that grace on a very base level is unmerited. never earn that favor that we're given through grace. So to me, the first thing that comes to mind when it says the manner of life be worthy, it's to constantly strive. I recently heard a quote, actually, just had to pull it up. Everybody that thinks you're spiritual based on your watering system, did you pray, did you read scripture, did you go to church today? Jesus tells us that to be fruit inspectors, though, the fruit will tell you what the tree is. And I thought of that quote when I was reading this because it's, a lot of times we think of being worthy as a checkbox when really it's an attitude of striving forward to, if we have these guidelines around ourselves and stop thinking of checkboxes, I think that's a lot more about what Paul's talking about, is that striving is, it's not that I'm checking my boxes every day. Did I do the things I have to do to be worthy?
Right.
It's, am I living my life in a way that Christ would say I'm worthy?
Yes, exactly. And that's, it really ties back to what we talked about last week with love, knowledge, and discernment. We've got to have all three. It's so easy to just get into, yep, I'm going to read. I've got all this head knowledge. I know what to do. I'm even doing the right things. But if you don't have that love, knowledge, and discernment, you're not going to be pure and blameless. It takes all three, for sure. Great point. Daryl.
Did you learn much about, that's an interesting statement where it says not frightened in anything by your opponents. Their world was, what they saw is different than what we see, and did you learn anything about who their opponents were? Because they were in a military city. Was there a contingent of Jews there? Maybe, is that what was?
So that's my assumption, is that yes, not only Jews and Judaizers, like we'll see that especially in chapter 3, but also just Roman citizens in the area that were not liking this group, obviously claiming a whole nother king is who we're supposed to be loyal to. But yeah, the same thing goes for us. We have opponents too, whether there's in the spiritual realm or in the physical realm, we have people that are opposing us for sure and do not want to see us, especially these days. I think we all can relate with those opponents for sure. And the way that we are able to defeat those is by being unified. That's our boldness comes through that, through working together. That's how we're going to be able to have no fear and overcome those opponents. Johnny?
When it says not frightened in anything by your opponents, I immediately took that be a David in the face of the lie.
Right, yep, that's a great point. Yep, absolutely no fear.
Doing that, he walked up in all humbleness. He was humble. He had the humility when he done that, but he knew God was there and God's not going to be overcome. So he stood firm and he stood out and he said, this is what's going to happen.
Exactly, yep. Rich?
Well, then you go past that to verse 29. I love how it's worded, for it's been granted to you, not only to believe, but suffer for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
Not many people are going to say thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And that was my next point, too. So that's a great segue into it, Rich. Yes. It's an interesting word there, too. Granted to you. So let's read that again. It has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe, but also suffer for his sake. That word granted, we've been talking about grace. That actually is what that word is. Charis. Maybe I'm saying that right. But regardless, the word is grace. So for the sake of Christ, we're graciously being granted suffering. How can that be? Anybody be able to, mesh those two things together?
Well, it says something about who you are,
Yeah,
suffering for doing it right.
for sure. Yep. And it definitely builds character, right? James? Rich?
Well, to know what you truly are, you need to be tested, and that purifies us.
Yes, exactly. It is, I think it was, James 1, 2 through 4. That's how we're made perfect and complete, is by facing those trials. Buddy?
Our suffering today isn't quite as physical or severe as this. But we do suffer because, well, there's this person I really get along with, but, well, they won't stop using profane language or chugging adult drinks. You know what? That you're not, we don't get along enough for me to tolerate you.
For sure.
Especially if you're not going to try to see my view, understand what I believe. And then Paul, in his letters, like if you read all the epistles that he wrote together, like all at the same time,
Yeah.
Because he's so good at like condensing, well, I mean, but it's true, but he's so good at, he's tactfully telling you why it's good that you're suffering.
Right.
You want to just get like, bust that door down to suffering.
Yeah, yep, he's all about that, and he's suffered more than any of us probably will, right? But, yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Just what you were saying, Christ told his followers, a servant is not greater than his master. If Christ suffered, we can be sure that we're going to be like him.
We're going to suffer too.
Maybe
Yep.
different ways.
Yes, which is what I wanted to bring up to him. Buddy really, hit the nail on the head with it, but yeah, we're not going to suffer that same way. I mean, I'm saying that emphatically. It's probably true. We're probably not going to be thrown in prison for being a Christian, but we will suffer in other ways. Buddy gave one example. Anybody think of anything else? Sound like he had another one. Jobs. That was one that I thought of too. Yep, you might end up losing a job. Maybe it's one that requires you to, work on a Sunday when you're supposed to be at worship. Maybe it's one, when I was in college, it was Olive Garden, wasn't it, Macy? That told me I would have to offer every table the wine list or something. I don't remember, but I told them I'm not comfortable with that, and they said, you can't work here. You never know what it might be. Robert?
I think everyone's making good points on it, and the fact that a lot of times, especially when we're growing up, when we're coming into the young adult aspect of becoming a Christian, we're told suffering like, yeah, I'm ready to suffer. We hear stories of Christians that suffered in China, leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, what was done to them in the USSR and things like that. We're like, I'm ready for that. But we're almost not willing to take on the quote-unquote lighter side of suffering, which might be suffering is sometimes giving up things that are sinful. I saw another quote that said, sin feels like freedom until you try to stop.
Yeah.
And it's one of those where it's like sometimes when you come to Christ, when you set your life in this way to strive, you're going to suffer because of choices you've made in the past. And it's part of the deal.
Yep.
But we've been granted the ability to suffer for Christ's sake.
Right. Yep. It's a granting to us. And I think this goes back to our first class and what we'll continue to talk about. When we identify ourselves as slaves, like this whole letter is about, when we identify ourselves as the lowest of the low, the scum of the earth, everything's going to be a joy then. That's why Paul has such joy in this book. He's suffering for the sake of Christ. He's finding those positives though. The gospel spreading. My brethren are strengthening. James tells us you are going to be made pure and complete from that. So Paul's just reminding us that this is a granting. This is a gracious thing when we suffer for the sake of Christ. Let's continue going. So Paul kind of sums things up here with, the word so. If there's any encouragement, complete my joy. Complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love. That really stuck out to me too. Complete my joy. Nothing would make Paul happier than for these people to be unified. I think we should think about that for a second. What would complete your joy? A Raiders Super Bowl? Man, that would bring me a lot of joy, that's for sure. Because I'd be there. That's for sure. What would it be? Your kids getting a full ride scholarship? I mean, we can think of a lot of things that we think would complete our joy. But Paul says his is that these brethren are unified. That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. It shows us too how heavenly minded he is, his eternal focus, all that hope that he has. He's worried about these brethren more than anything. So in this same passage, and we've talked about this, especially with Macy's comment, this unity that Paul wants them to have. What's he say the key is? How is this unity achieved? Yep, that unity, right? That unity is how we're going to be able, and looking at the interests of others, right? Do nothing from selfish ambition. Do nothing from conceit. In humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Don't look out for your own interest, but the interests of others. So basically, completely empty yourself, count yourself as nothing. That's how you're going to have unity. That's what's going to complete Paul's joy. But going back to the very beginning of this, that's how we're made worthy of the gospel too. Which I know we've hinted at this already, but I think it's important to note that we do not attain worthiness of the gospel by filling ourselves, by taking things into our own hands. It's by completely emptying ourselves and putting everyone else above us and acting as slaves. And that's what we're going to talk about as it goes into the next few verses in the example of Christ. Robert?
I was just going to say that this also feels like the do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. How often is our servitude another checkbox where it's whether we realize it or not, it's because of our ambition. Our ambition tells us that, well, I need to do this so I can be better, so that I can. But when we stop with the check boxes and we live our lives on a path, it becomes part of our day instead of a goal of our day.
Right.
With the Pope during whatnot, I was thinking about another quote I've heard in the movie Colonial. There's a line that says, ambition is the moth of holiness. It destroys, the anti-ambition destroys holiness. I don't know, I've tried a lot in the past few years to stop thinking of my life as a Christian as check boxes. And even if we think, well, I'm not being selfish, I'm serving others, sometimes that service can be out of selfish ambition.
They definitely can.
I think it's something to seriously consider when we try to self-reflect as we go through these.
Yeah, it definitely can. That's a great point, Robert. Yeah, we're kind of getting a glimpse here of what this church, one of their issues that they had, and we'll see it a lot more in chapter 4. But this unity, and what's the why do we have problems with unity? It's self-centeredness, ambition. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? Like you'd think, man, I'm going to go get it. But we're about to see through the example of Christ. No, you empty yourself. Buddy?
This shows the importance of really, really knowing Christ, because I want to say we're united. But if we took a poll, a private poll, and we listed every same question for everybody, those answers might not be the same. So it's vital that we know Christ.
Yep, definitely. All right, so let's continue on because this is a great segue into where Paul is heading now. So without putting the stressful slide back up there, basically what Paul is doing is he's setting the stage with lower yourself, empty yourself. That's the key. Here's some examples of people that embody this perfectly. First example is Jesus. Then we go into Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Paul. I'm hoping we can get through Jesus, Timothy, and Epaphroditus because those two will go pretty fast. We will not even touch on Paul today. But let's go into that, and I need another reader. This is the main poem. So Robert, this is the big one.
Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Thank you, Robert. I wish we could you could spend multiple classes on just these verses. I realize that. And we will still have to get through this in 10 minutes so that we have 10 minutes for the other two. But this is something worth committing to memory, hanging somewhere, reading regularly, because that's what this whole book is about. This is what the whole idea of being a Christian is about, is we are all to be living as Christ did. And the way that we start this off talking about Christ, and I promise I will open it up, but I'm going to try and get through a little bit of it. But though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself and took the form of a slave. When I first read that, my mind went right back to the garden. And I think I talked about this in an invitation. Everyone forgets those anyways, but forgive me if you're like, oh, he said this before. But my mind went right there because from the very beginning of time, we have Adam, which I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but Adam, that just means man, because we're all just like him. And he wants to be like God. Genesis 3:5. Rodney talked about this in his sermon on Sunday. He's not here. I've given him credit for multiple sermons, and he's not been here. But Rodney talked about this too. Adam's goal in taking of the fruit was he wanted to be like God. And what does he do? Takes it into his own hands. He's going to try and do it himself. He's taking something, and he's going to fill himself. And by doing that, he thinks, I'm going to be made like God. But we know, in a way, he did become like God. But did this result in any bit of exaltation like he was wanting? No. It failed miserably because he tried to take this into his own hands when we have to be like Christ and completely do the opposite. We don't take it into our own hands. If you're trying to be like God and you want exaltation like we all do, we all want to, in the end, be exalted with Christ and be resurrected with him. It's not through filling ourselves or taking it into our own hands. It is by completely emptying ourselves. That's exactly what Christ did. Not only did he already exist in the form of God, he lowered himself all the way down to a human. And there's that word again. Doulos, servant, slave, the lowest of the low. Like, it'd be one thing if he came down, and he actually became a king like a lot of the Israelites were hoping. A lot of those Jews were kind of, hoping this man would come down and just do away with everything. He'd come with a gold crown, and, even that would be like, man, he lowered himself quite a bit to go from God to even an earthly king. But he didn't even do that. He went all the way to the bottom of the totem pole, lower than any of us in this room physically are, right? Yet he existed in the form of God. He's showing us the way. He's showing us how we are to basically get back to the garden. That's what the whole Bible's about, right? The whole Bible can be summed up in our journey back to the Garden of Eden because we tried to take it into our own hands and we got banished from it. The whole goal of us is to get back there. And Christ is showing us that. So not only did he come down and take the form of a slave, but he humbled himself all the way to the point of death, even the death on a cross. And that cross is emphasized here because we know that was, he's just putting the icing on the cake of like, this man went low as low gets, all the way to a slave, and then gets hung on a Roman cross next to thieves in the most excruciating fashion we can imagine. I really think Paul's just emphasizing here, you can't get lower. You just can't. And he was God. But what did it result in? After he did that, God highly exalted him. There's the key. That's what we've been trying to emphasize through this whole letter and why I feel like that's this main theme, because the path back to the garden is through lowering ourselves. And that's how Christ was exalted. Now, I've been talking for a little bit. Let's open it up. Anybody other thoughts?
That first line, I saw a translation that said that he, even though he was in the form of God, he didn't count it as something to be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
He didn't use it for his own.
Yeah, he didn't use it for his own advantage. Yeah, it wasn't a thing to be grasped or to be taken advantage of. Yes, that's a great point. Anybody else? Tom.
He had a mission, and he stuck to it. We have a mission we have to stick to.
Yep, we have to stick to it. That's exactly right. Buddy?
You mentioned his descent. It was from the highest high. He was with God. There's no higher brightness. He's there. Well, we can't lower ourselves that much. We could lower ourselves to the bottom or closer to the bottom.
Exactly. Way closer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. The difference in the two is astronomical than we could ever. We can't get even lower, and we started way lower. So yes, it's just emphasizing this is the perfect example of what it is like to be a Christian. Obviously, we know that. I'm not saying anything revolutionary like, yeah, we need to be like Jesus. But we need to remember this picture that he painted. I came from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. I was way higher than you ever were. I was way lower than you'll ever be. And that resulted in me not only getting exalted, but now every tongue, every creature, man, woman, and child is going to bow before him because He humbled and emptied himself to the point of a slave. And if we want that exaltation, it's the same path. Robert?
Verse 5 ties us back to what we've just been talking about, which is about how we're supposed to do all of these things, how we're supposed to be a servant, things like that. And I really like how Paul puts this emphasis on, he's saying this is what you need to do for others. And in verse 5 he says, have Christ's mind because this. And then he goes into, I could read it all off, but I mean, he paints this picture of God who comes to earth to the bottom and then is exalted. And it's one of those where it's like, if you need a reason, if you need more reason, if we're looking back at 1 through 4, he's saying, here's the reason.
Yep.
Sometimes when we have to break them up, I think it's hard to put those thoughts together, but
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Because they all read this at once, right? So that, hey, you guys got to have the same mind. Oh, by the way, it's the mind of Christ. Those are perfectly connected. So thank you for connecting those. Because, yeah, that's the hard part with this is you break them up in slides and, you know, our brains have left that and now we're on to this next one. But they're all perfectly tied. And it is that mind of Christ that he's telling them all to have. All right, we're not done. Anybody else? I'm going to move on to the next passage. We're not done with the example of Christ, but we're going to go to 12 through 18. Anything else? Okay. So this little section, yeah, he's kind of, that poem is over, but he has not moved on to the second and third example of Timothy and Epaphroditus. He kind of enters into a section here where he's just, you know, he's interjected another little bit of encouragement to these guys. And so let me get a reader. Johnny, go ahead.
Therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Hold fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you should also be glad and rejoice with me.
Perfect. Thank you, Johnny. Okay. So like I said, a little section here of encouragement to them, and of course it starts with therefore. So, therefore, after we've talked about Christ, here's how you are to live. First thing he goes into. Therefore, because of this life of Christ, you need to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. What's the first thing we think of when we hear that verse? Or maybe it's just me. Anybody? Yeah, it's scary, right? With awe and reverence, we're to be working out our own salvation. I mean, it does sound like a little bit of a scary picture. One of the first things I thought of course, is, you know, and I didn't have like I didn't have any commentaries or anything when I went on this, but I did Google that verse just to see what would pop up. And all of it, article after article after article, was basically trying to prove why this doesn't mean you have to work for your salvation. I'm not sure, I didn't read those, but that would take some convincing, wouldn't it? Because it's pretty obvious here that we've got to do something. With fear and trembling, we're to be working out our salvation. Tom?
Did not Jesus sanctify for himself people zealous of good works?
Exactly. Yep.
He wasn't talking about work out your own salvation to become saved. He's talking about people who already are saved, have a job to do.
Right, exactly. And like we've been hinting at anyways, is there anything really we can do on our own to live worthy of the gospel or to even gain that salvation? We know that. Not at all. He says it himself. For it is God who works in you. He says it in the very next verse. It's God that's working in us anyways, but we still have a job to do with awe and reverence. We've got to be working out our own salvation with fear and trembling. And we know, from James 2, our works justify our faith. Even in verse 16, he talks about holding fast to the gospel so that Paul's labor's not in vain. Basically saying, keep doing what you're doing. I don't want all the stuff I'm doing to be pointless because y'all screwed it up right there at the end. Buddy?
This is the second time, at least, that he's mentioned whether he's there or he's not there. You have to do this.
Yep.
Because Jesus isn't there.
Yeah.
They have the word.
Exactly.
Jesus is, he's not there. You
Yeah.
have to have that internal thing.
Exactly. Yep. And it requires us working together, obviously, too. But it is interesting, too, that it says to work out your own salvation. We're talking about unity and unity and unity, and obviously that is the key to all of this. But at the same time, we're held accountable for our own salvations. Robert?
How easy is it for us when we have like a gospel meeting or something like that to feel really fired up, and during the gospel meeting you feel like you're on topic and you're just in the groove. Then the gospel meeting ends and you kind of only start to feel that on Sundays and Wednesdays when you're around your breath, and then you go home and you feel like you're falling out of the groove. I think one of the things he's saying is, because Paul is saying, he's been there. So he's saying, in my presence, but much more in my absence. He's saying, even though I'm not there, you've got to stay in the groove.
Right.
And the only way to do that is if you build your own salvation on that respect, that fear and trembling of the Lord and understanding. We just talked about how God has the power to destroy. How through their example, he's going to show others their destruction and our salvation, their destruction through how we live. So what he's saying is, you know what happens if you don't follow. You must figure this out on your own and establish it for yourself to stay, like the term, stay in the groove.
Right, exactly. Yep, that's a great point. Staying in the groove with it, yeah. Anything else? We can move on to the next part then. So, Paul tells them, do all things without grumbling and disputing. When you see that word grumbling, what's your brain go to? Yep, the Israelites, the Jews, right? This word, I actually heard somewhere that this word, gogosmos, something like that it's not said in the New Testament. I counted that it is 4 times, but not very often. Tons in the Old Testament, though, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Tons because of the Israelites. Grumbling in the wilderness. And I think that's where he's trying to point their minds, because there was a lot of grumbling going on there. What about disputing, though? Disputing. No grumbling or disputing. What do you think of with disputing? It's not really a trick question. Just kind of bickering, right?
If you go back, how many times did they dispute Moses being the leader?
Yeah.
And everything?
Yep, exactly. And I think it's easy for us to look at them and we're like, man, these jokers, like they get to the edge of the Red Sea and they're like, oh, great, God, are you going to save it? Yep, he parts it. They start going across. Oh, man, what about these guys chasing us? Tramples them. All right, 3 days later, we're thirsty. Here's some water. This water ain't too good. He gives them some better. Hey, we're getting hungry. Here's some bread. Hey, this bread ain't too good. All right, here's some quail, and I'll give it to you till you just can't even take it anymore. I mean, and we look at them and we're like, man, y'all were seeing some miracles. How on earth could you grumble about that? But we got to self-reflect, because we live a very cushy life. Every single one of us in here, cushy, very, especially in the history of man, AC, padded pews, cars with AC. I mean, we live in 70 degrees Fahrenheit, don't we? On beds, silk sheets, and we're still grumbling and disputing, and we're complaining. I'm not exempt, especially in traffic. We're all that way, and it's no different. We look at them and we just scoff like, man, you saw bread coming from the sky and you're still complaining. Man, we are waking up in just the golden era of man, and we're still complaining too. So we're not exempt from this. I know it's easy to, point fingers at the Israelites, and I definitely think that's where he's pointing back to. But we are the same way, and we have to remember that to shine as lights in the world, we can't be complaining and disputing about the silliest little things, because the world is not going to want to follow us. If we're just a miserable people and we're just, oh, this has been a hard time, my leg hurts and my throat's, this pollen's all over the place, and, it hadn't rained forever, now it's raining nonstop. Who's going to want to follow that? Nobody. We're bickering over everything. We can't get along because we're building a new building and so-and-so wants the pews blue and so-and-so wants them tie-dye, and it's like, who cares? Nobody's going to want to follow those people. It's a miserable people to follow. But if we're going to shine as lights in the world and say, world, this is who you are to follow, we can't be grumbling and disputing. Robert?
Can you see the difference when you see a group of people who are volunteering, the ones that actually chose to be there, and the ones that have to be be there. When I was in
Definitely.
college, I had to do community service as part of my financial aid. And the things that I volunteered for that I enjoyed, man, it was a joy to be there. And the things that I just kind of had to do because, like, man, I got to get some more hours in, you could tell my attitude was different than
Oh, yeah.
people's. And that's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
We all do it to each other. You can see through Christians. And what I mean is the world can see through me if I do not have that genuine attitude of service, the joy of service. If I'm, man, I don't really want to do this for this person, but I need to be a servant. That's not being a servant.
Right, exactly. But when people looked at someone like Paul, who is sitting in prison, and all he's saying is joy, joy, count it all joy, that's a man people want to follow. Like, man, you could get loaded all the way to prison, and he's still got joy. That's somebody I want to follow. Not when we're sitting here and we're complaining about every little thing that comes across. And we are all guilty of that because, I mean, we like our lives a certain way. And when somebody, isn't going 55 and a 40, and we're trying to get somewhere, that gets on our nerves a little bit, doesn't it? And people see that. Obviously that carries on to places where people are going to see, and they're not going to want to follow that.
Do you think this means that that's possibly, like, they maybe had a little bit of problem with this, that he even mentions it?
I think it definitely could. I mean, that's what a lot of people think too. Like, unity is brought up so many times, and we will see that in chapter 4. Like, there's a couple there with a little tiff going, and so I definitely think this is part of it that they're experiencing, because all of us are, but definitely there too. Charlie?
It's just our life struggle. We're carnal human beings, and we have to try to overcome that, like Christ overcame that he was human and had the same feelings and thoughts that we had, and he was able to overcome. And I think that's just the struggle, and hence, he wants us to have self-control and knowledge and discernment and stuff like that, But even in our humility, I'm really humble. I'm the
Yeah.
humblest person around.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
Stuff like, it's hard not to be human.
Oh, yeah, it definitely is. Yep, it's a very challenging thing for sure. Tom?
Talking about challenging things and the murmuring of the Israelites. We're told, when we have food and clothing, therewith we content. For 40 years, their clothes didn't wear out, much less his feet.
Right, exactly. Yep, exactly. Anything else? Teresa?
In Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. That just reminds me, if I'm working for myself or working for men, I'm going to be grumbling and disputing.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to like it.
Yes.
If I'm working heartily for the Lord, I can withstand it. I can withstand the 12 hours at work with the cursing and the whatever, patients like to do to me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And I can be that light that
Yeah.
shines no matter what.
Right. It's all about that perspective, isn't it? Seeing ourselves as slaves. I mean, it's one of those things too where when you view yourself that low, it's easy to find the joys in the little things. When you're working for others or you're working for God, it's a lot harder to get bogged down in that stuff. One of the cures for depression would be to just serve others. Spend some time putting into other people. We're not going to get through any of this, are we? All right, so we're definitely going to do Timothy and Epaphroditus next time. The last thing I had, just so that we can put a bow on at least 12 through 18, I don't have a lot to say about it. I just thought it was really interesting that Paul said, even if I'm to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith. I didn't have a ton to say about that, but it's just an interesting concept. We don't even know if Paul was referring to Old Testament drink offerings or maybe some kind of pagan ritual, since this was a super Roman colony. Regardless, the same premise applies. The drink offering was something, and Daryl would probably know way more about this, but what I gathered was the drink offering is more of like a supplemental offering. It's poured out completely. It was a valuable liquid, but it's not the main show. It's a side note. And Paul says, even if I am going to completely empty my life, which is subs to you, you're the main event, then I still will be glad and rejoice. It just shows Paul's attitude, again, about his situation. And even if he was to be completely poured out, he would still rejoice. Sorry we didn't get through everything. I thought with having 50 minutes, we definitely would. But I appreciate all the comments. These next two will be super fast, and we won't get through chapter 3 if we're being realistic, but we will finish this book in 2 more classes. Sunday, you will not see me. You'll see Art, so prepare for marriage class. Thank you for your comments.